Jordan Peterson came prepared to intellectually dismantle Jonathan Roumie's Christian faith on his podcast, armed with decades of psychological research, biblical scholarship, and philosophical frameworks that had convinced millions that faith was merely archetypal truth rather than literal reality. But when the Jesus actor quietly revealed the 3 words Jordan's father whispered on his deathbed, words no one else in the world knew, Canada's most brilliant mind collapsed in his chair, sobbing uncontrollably before his audience of 15 million listeners. What Jonathan pulled from his pocket wasn't just a letter. It was impossible evidence of something that shattered every rationalization Jordan had built between himself and God for 30 years. The intellectual interrogation Jordan designed to expose religious naivety became the moment his father reached across eternity to finally answer the question that had haunted his son since the day he died. "That's impossible. Nobody knows he said that to me," Jordan whispered, his hands trembling as he stared at the handwritten words that matched exactly what his father spoke in that hospital room 3 decades ago. His legendary composure, the clinical detachment that made him famous, crumbled like sand as the weight of something beyond explanation crashed through his carefully constructed worldview. The podcast studio fell into stunned silence as millions of viewers watched the world's most analytical mind encounter evidence that analysis couldn't dismiss, couldn't rationalize, couldn't explain away. 2 hours earlier, Jordan Peterson sat in his book-lined study, reviewing notes with the confident precision of a surgeon preparing for a routine procedure. "This will be a fascinating exploration of how actors embody archetypal narratives," he told his producer, gesturing toward research papers about the psychology of religious belief and the neuroscience of spiritual experiences. "I want to understand how someone can portray Christ without falling into either naive literalism or cynical performance." His assistant had cautioned him that Jonathan Roumie carried an unusual depth, something different from typical celebrity believers, but Jordan dismissed the concern with a slight wave of his hand and that characteristic intensity in his eyes. After all, he had spent decades debating theologians, philosophers, and scholars across every tradition. He had mapped the psychological architecture of religious meanings so thoroughly that he could predict every defensive argument a believer might offer. How challenging could it be to discuss faith with an actor, however sincere, who played Jesus in a streaming series? What Jordan didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have predicted, was that Jonathan Roumie had been preparing for this conversation not for hours but for 3 years, and his preparation had nothing to do with intellectual arguments and everything to do with impossible knowledge that would break through 3 decades of brilliant rationalization in a single, devastating moment. Jonathan Roumie arrived at the podcast studio carrying only 2 items: his grandfather's weathered Lebanese Bible with its cracked leather cover and pages yellowed from decades of handling, and a sealed envelope he had written 3 years ago but never mailed. He had spent the morning in prayer, not asking for victory in some theological debate, but for the wisdom to see past Jordan's formidable intellect to the wounded son still hiding behind it. He had watched countless hours of Jordan's lectures, not to prepare counterarguments, but to understand the shape of his pain. In every brilliant analysis of meaning and purpose, in every passionate defense of religious truth as psychological necessity, Jonathan recognized something he had seen before: a man trying to honor his father's faith without surrendering to it, trying to believe in God without trusting him. The makeup artist commented on how unusually calm Jonathan seemed, especially compared to other guests who arrived visibly nervous before facing Peterson's legendary intensity and rapid-fire questioning. "I'm not here to debate him," Jonathan said gently, his voice carrying a peace that seemed to radiate from somewhere deeper than confidence. "I'm here because his father asked me to come." The makeup artist looked confused, but Jonathan simply smiled and opened his Bible to a page marked with a faded ribbon, a page he had been led to in prayer 6 months ago, a page that contained words he knew would change everything. Jordan entered the studio with his characteristic purposeful stride, greeting Jonathan with genuine warmth and intellectual curiosity. There was no hostility in his approach, only the intense focus of a brilliant mind encountering a subject he found genuinely fascinating. "Jonathan, thank you for doing this," Jordan said, settling into his chair with that familiar forward lean, hands already gesturing as his thoughts began to form into words. "I've been thinking about the psychological implications of your work, the way embodying Christ might affect someone's understanding of archetypal truth. Jonathan smiled and nodded, watching Jordan with eyes that held something beyond normal attention, something that made Jordan pause for just a fraction of a second before continuing. The cameras began rolling and Jordan launched into his introduction with the eloquence and precision his audience expected, framing the conversation as an exploration of how ancient narratives function in modern consciousness, how myth and meaning intersect in the human psyche. But as he spoke, as he built his framework of analysis and interpretation, Jonathan simply sat quietly, waiting. He knew that all of Jordan's brilliant questions, all of his carefully constructed philosophical scaffolding, would eventually crumble before 3 simple words written in the envelope resting in his jacket pocket. 3 words that Jordan's father had spoken in his final moments. 3 words that no living person except Jordan knew. 3 words that would prove beyond any intellectual doubt that something real, something impossible, something divine had been orchestrating this moment for 3 decades. Jordan began the interview with his signature intellectual intensity, leaning forward with that characteristic focus that had captivated millions. Jonathan, let's start with what I find most fascinating about your portrayal of Christ in The Chosen. You're embodying what Jung would call the central archetype of Western consciousness, the self-sacrificing hero who dies and is reborn. How do you navigate the tension between performing a mythological figure and the claims of literal historical truth? The question was vintage Peterson, brilliant and complex, designed to explore the intersection of psychology and theology without forcing a simple answer. Jonathan's response came with a calmness that immediately disrupted Jordan's expected flow. Jordan, what if I told you that the tension you're describing only exists when we assume that psychological truth and literal truth are competing rather than confirming each other? What if the resurrection is psychologically true precisely because it literally happened? Jordan's eyebrow raised, that telltale sign that he was encountering an unexpected formulation. That's an interesting inversion of the typical fundamentalist position, he said, his voice carrying both approval and curiosity. But surely you can see the epistemological problem. We can verify psychological effects. We can measure how belief in resurrection transforms lives. But the historical claim itself requires a leap that reason cannot make. Jonathan opened his grandfather's Bible, running his fingers across the Arabic notations in the margins. My grandfather fled Lebanon during the Civil War. He watched his brother murdered for refusing to renounce Christ. As he died, my uncle said something that haunted my grandfather for the rest of his life. Jordan leaned forward, genuinely engaged despite himself. He said, "I'm not dying for a metaphor. I'm dying because I met him." The story landed with unexpected weight, and Jordan felt something shift in his chest, something uncomfortably personal. That's a powerful testimony to the psychological reality of belief, Jordan countered, his voice carrying a slight defensive edge. Human beings will die for what they believe to be true, even when it's not literally factual. That's well documented throughout history. Jonathan's eyes held Jordan's with a gentleness that somehow felt more penetrating than any aggressive challenge. Jordan, can I ask you something personal about your father? The question hung in the air like a thunderclap. Jordan's entire demeanor changed in an instant, his shoulders tensing, his analytical mask slipping just slightly. What about my father? His voice was careful now, guarded in a way it hadn't been moments before. You've spoken beautifully in your lectures about his integrity, his strength, his faith, Jonathan continued, his tone impossibly compassionate. But you always stop short of something. You describe his belief with respect, even admiration, but there's always this intellectual distance, this need to translate what he simply trusted into something more psychologically sophisticated. Jordan's jaw tightened and he shifted in his chair, a rare display of discomfort from a man usually completely composed. My father was a deeply good man, Jordan said, his voice taking on that professorial tone he used when lecturing rather than conversing. His faith worked for him within his context, his understanding, his time. But we have access to knowledge he didn't have, frameworks that allow us to understand religious truth in more nuanced ways. Jonathan nodded slowly, and then asked the question that would begin to unravel everything. What if the knowledge you have isn't more sophisticated than your father's faith, Jordan? What if it's just safer? The question struck Jordan like a physical blow, and for a moment the brilliant psychologist who could analyze anyone's defenses couldn't find words to defend his own. Safer? He repeated, his voice carrying an edge of indignation mixed with something deeper, something vulnerable. I've spent my entire career encouraging people to pursue truth regardless of comfort, to confront chaos, to bear their cross. How is that safe? Jonathan's expression remained compassionate, almost sorrowful, as if he was watching someone in pain rather than engaging in intellectual combat. You encourage others to bear their cross, yes. But Jordan, your father didn't ask you to bear yours. In his final days, he asked you to do something much harder. He asked you to lay it down at the foot of another cross. And you've spent 30 years explaining why that's psychologically unnecessary. The words landed with devastating accuracy, and Jordan's face transformed. His hands gripped the arms of his chair, his breathing became shallow, and behind his eyes something ancient and buried began to surface. You don't know what you're talking about, Jordan said, but his voice cracked, betraying the wound that had just been exposed. My father understood that I operate on a different intellectual level. He respected my need to integrate faith with reason, to find a path that honored both truth and meaning. Jonathan leaned forward, his voice gentle but unyielding. Jordan, what did your father say to you in the hospital, 3 days before he died? When it was just the two of you, and he took your hand, and he asked you that one question. Jordan's face went pale. His mouth opened but no sound came out. His legendary composure shattered completely as tears began forming in his eyes. How could you possibly know about that? He whispered, his voice barely audible. No one else was in that room. I never told anyone. I've never spoken publicly about that conversation. The podcast studio fell into absolute silence. The crew members stopped moving, sensing they were witnessing something far beyond a typical interview. Jordan's hands were trembling now, and he stared at Jonathan with a mixture of shock, fear, and desperate hope. That's impossible, Jordan said, his clinical mind trying to find rational explanations even as his heart knew he was encountering something that transcended rationality. You couldn't know. There's no way you could know what he said. Jonathan reached slowly into his jacket pocket and pulled out the sealed envelope, its edges worn from 3 years of being carried close to his heart. Jordan, I need to tell you something that's going to sound impossible, and I need you to stay with me even though every analytical instinct you have will want to reject it. He held the envelope without opening it, and Jordan stared at it as if it were a bomb about to explode his entire worldview. 3 years ago, I was praying one morning, and I felt an overwhelming burden to pray for you specifically. I didn't know why. I'd never met you, though I'd watched your lectures and respected your work. But the burden was so strong that I couldn't ignore it. And as I prayed, 3 words came into my mind so clearly that I wrote them down immediately. Jordan's breathing became rapid, his face a mixture of terror and wonder. What words? He asked, though something in his voice suggested he already knew, already feared, already hoped. The same 3 words your father spoke to you in that hospital room, Jonathan said quietly. The question he asked that you've been running from ever since. The question you never answered. Jordan's entire body went rigid as if struck by lightning, and tears began streaming down his face before he could stop them. Open it, he whispered, his voice breaking. Open the envelope. Jonathan carefully broke the seal, unfolded the letter, and turned it so Jordan could see the date written at the top, 3 years earlier, and below it in Jonathan's handwriting, 3 simple words. Do you trust? The envelope fell from Jordan's trembling hands as 3 decades of carefully constructed intellectual barriers collapsed in an instant. That's exactly what he said, Jordan breathed, his face contorted with emotion he could no longer contain. He took my hand and he looked at me with those eyes, those dying eyes, and he asked me, do you trust? Not do you believe, not do you understand, not can you explain. Just do you trust? His voice rose with anguish. And I failed him, Jonathan. I gave him philosophy when he wanted faith. I explained the psychological benefits of trust when he was asking me to actually do it. I lectured him about the neurological basis of belief when he was begging me to just surrender. Jordan covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from a place he'd kept locked for 30 years. He died 3 days later, and I never answered his question. I never gave him the one thing he wanted from me. The millions watching saw something they'd never witnessed before: Jordan Peterson, the man who could articulate meaning for everyone else, completely undone by the meaning he'd been avoiding in himself. Jonathan's own tears flowed freely as he watched the breakthrough happening in real time. "Jordan, your father didn't ask you that question just for himself," Jonathan said, his voice thick with emotion. "He asked it for you. He knew that all your brilliance, all your understanding, all your incredible ability to map meaning would eventually lead you to this moment where you'd have to choose between explanation and experience." Jordan looked up, his face raw and vulnerable in a way the world had never seen. "But how did you know? How could you possibly know those exact words?" His analytical mind was still trying to find rationality even as his heart was breaking open. "Because he told me," Jonathan said simply, and the statement hung in the air like an impossibility that demanded to be true. "Not physically, not audibly, but 3 years ago when I was praying for you, I heard those words so clearly it was as if someone spoke them directly into my spirit. And I absolutely knew, that I was supposed to carry them until the day I could give them back to you." Jordan stared at Jonathan with a mixture of awe and terror, his worldview cracking apart like ice under sudden heat. "This violates everything I understand about causation, about temporal reality, about the boundaries between the living and the dead," he said, but his voice carried wonder rather than rejection. "And yet I can't deny it. I can't rationalize it away. I can't reduce it to coincidence or psychology or wishful thinking." He picked up the envelope again, staring at the date, the words, the impossible evidence. "My father somehow reached across 3 decades to answer the question I never let him finish asking." Jonathan nodded, pulling out his grandfather's Bible and opening it to a page marked with a faded photograph. "There's more, Jordan. Look at this." He turned the Bible toward Jordan, revealing a photo of a young man in military uniform, and written on the back in Arabic were words Jonathan had translated months ago. "For the son who thinks too much to simply believe, tell him his father's love was only a shadow of the father's love." Jordan took the Bible with shaking hands, staring at words written decades ago by a man he'd never met, words that spoke directly to the core of his struggle. "This is impossible," he whispered. "And yet it's the most real thing I've ever encountered." Jordan sat in stunned silence for nearly a full minute, the podcast continuing to record as millions watched a transformation happening in real time. When he finally spoke, his voice was small and broken in a way that revealed the man behind the professor, the wounded son behind the brilliant psychologist. "I don't know what to do with this," he said, looking at Jonathan with eyes that pleaded for guidance. "My entire career, everything I've built, has been about explaining faith in terms that the intellect can accept. I've helped millions of people find meaning by showing them how religious truth operates psychologically. But now you're telling me that while I was teaching people about the map, I was refusing to enter the territory." The words came out between tears, and Jordan made no attempt to hide his brokenness anymore. "You're telling me that my father's simple trust was deeper than all my complex understanding. That his willingness to just surrender was wiser than my need to comprehend before I commit." Jonathan leaned forward, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had walked through his own darkness into light. "Jordan, your father wasn't disappointed in your intellect. He was proud of your mind. But he knew something you're only discovering now, that brilliance can be either a bridge to God or a barrier, and the difference is whether you're using it to serve love or to replace it." The truth of those words shattered something fundamental in Jordan's chest, and he felt decades of defensive architecture collapsing. "All my lectures about bearing your cross, about confronting chaos, about the heroic individual facing the dragon of disorder," his voice cracked with recognition, "it's all been a way to talk about Christianity without having to do what Christ actually asks, which is to stop being the hero of my own story and let him be the hero instead." He looked at the envelope, at the Bible, at the impossible evidence scattered before him. "I've been the rich young ruler, haven't I?" Jesus loved him, the scripture says, but he walked away sad because he couldn't let go of his wealth. Except my wealth isn't money. It's my ability to understand, to explain, to maintain intellectual control. Jonathan nodded, his own tears flowing. And just like with the rich young ruler, Jesus loves you, Jordan. He's loved you through every lecture, every debate, every brilliant analysis that kept you at arm's length from actual surrender. Your father knew that. That's why he asked the question. Not to condemn you, but to invite you past your last defense. Jordan's face transformed as the full weight of grace crashed through his remaining walls. He's been waiting for me, Jordan whispered in wonder. All this time, through every rationalization, every framework, every sophisticated explanation, he's just been waiting for me to answer the question. Do I trust? The studio remained in absolute silence as Jordan Peterson, the man who had taught millions how to find meaning, discovered that meaning had been pursuing him all along. I want to, Jordan said, his voice stronger now despite the tears. I want to answer my father's question. I want to trust. But I don't know how to do it, Jonathan. I don't know how to let go of the need to understand everything first. Jonathan's smile was radiant with compassion. You just did, Jordan. The moment you admitted you don't know how is the moment you stepped into trust. Faith isn't certainty. It's not having all the answers. It's being willing to follow even when you can't see the whole path. He held up the envelope with the 3 words. Your father asked, "Do you trust?" And today, 30 years later, you finally said yes. Not with your intellect, but with your heart. And that's what he was waiting to hear. That's what God was waiting to hear. The transformation visible on Jordan Peterson's face was profound and undeniable, as if decades of tension had finally released and something new was being born in real time. I feel different, he said, his voice filled with childlike wonder that seemed completely foreign coming from one of the world's most formidable intellectuals. It's not that my mind has stopped working or that I've abandoned reason. It's that for the first time in my life, I feel like my intellect is serving something greater rather than defending against it. He looked at Jonathan with gratitude that radiated from somewhere deep within. Is this what my father experienced? This sense that you're finally home after decades of wandering? Jonathan's response was immediate and wholehearted. It's exactly what he experienced, Jordan. And he's rejoicing right now, not because you finally got smart enough to believe, but because you finally got humble enough to trust. The simple truth of those words landed like a benediction, and Jordan laughed through his tears, a sound of pure relief and joy. I want to learn how to do this, Jordan said, his characteristic intensity now channeled in a completely new direction. Not how to explain it or map it or teach it, but how to actually live it. How to pray like my father prayed, how to trust like he trusted, how to rest in God's love instead of constantly trying to earn it through understanding. He picked up Jonathan's grandfather's Bible, holding it with reverence. Will you teach me? Will you show me how to read these words not as a psychologist analyzing archetypal patterns, but as a son listening to his father? Jonathan reached across and placed his hand on Jordan's shoulder. I won't teach you, Jordan, because you don't need another teacher. You need a companion on the journey. We'll discover together what it means when brilliance bows before love, when the mind that can explain everything learns to simply receive. He opened his phone and showed Jordan something that made the professor's eyes widen. I want you to see the prayer I wrote this morning before coming here. The screen displayed a note dated that very day. Father, today I meet Jordan. Let him discover that his father's question wasn't a test he failed, but an invitation he's finally ready to accept. Let him come home. Jordan stared at the words, overwhelmed by the reality that his life had been forever altered by someone who had been faithfully carrying him in prayer for 3 years. You really believed this would happen? He asked, his voice full of awe. You had faith that after 30 years of running, I would finally stop? Jonathan's answer was simple and profound. I had faith that love always wins, Jordan. That truth is more persistent than resistance, that grace is more patient than fear, and that your father's prayers planted seeds that God promised would one day bloom. In the months that followed, Jordan Peterson's work underwent a remarkable transformation. His lectures still carried the same intellectual rigor and psychological depth, but now they flowed from a place of surrender rather than control, from trust rather than mastery. He began each day reading scripture not as an analyst studying ancient texts, but as a son listening for his father's voice. His friendship with Jonathan became a powerful testimony to how the searching mind and the surrendered heart are not enemies but partners in the greatest adventure of all, knowing and being known by the God who created both reason and love. Jordan often spoke about how his father's question had been pursuing him through every lecture, every book, every framework he built, waiting patiently for the day he would finally be ready to answer it. And whenever someone asked him about the moment everything changed, he would smile with a peace that transcended all his former understanding and say simply, "I spent 30 years trying to explain my way to God, and it turns out he was waiting for me to trust my way to him instead." If you're watching this and your intellect has become a wall instead of a window, if you've been so busy explaining God that you've forgotten how to encounter him, maybe it's time to hear the question Jordan's father asked, the question that echoes through every human heart. Do you trust? Not can you prove it, not can you understand it fully, not can you make it fit your frameworks, but simply, humbly, courageously, do you trust? The same Christ who pursued the brilliant professor across 3 decades is pursuing you right now, not asking you to stop thinking, but inviting you to let your thoughts bow before love. This isn't about abandoning reason. It's about discovering what reason was always meant to serve. If this story touched something in you, share your reflections in the comments below. Have you been using your mind as a shield against surrender, or as a bridge toward it? Subscribe for more stories of how seeking minds discover the truth that sets them free, and let today be the day you answer the question your heart has been avoiding. Will you trust?